Welcome. I'm thrilled to see such a great turnout for what promises to be an engaging discussion on Backdraft, the conflict potential of climate change adaptation and mitigation. My name is Roger Mark D'Souza. I'm the Director of Population, Environmental Change and Security here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I'm in my third week in the job, so it's a thrill in this first month to welcome you to such an exciting and engaging topic. And for me, this report really focuses on a critical question, and those of you who have glanced at the report already will recognize this question. Could efforts to reduce our carbon footprint and lower our vulnerability to climate change inadvertently exacerbate existing conflicts or create new ones? And for me, this is a perfect question for us to explore from our perch here at the Wilson Center. As many of you know who've attended our events here at the center, the Wilson Center is the formal memorial to our 28th president, the only president thus far to have achieved a PhD. And here at the center, we aim to bring the worlds of policy, practice, and academia together to gain a better understanding of how to inform each other. And for this particular report, which you have the introduction outside, on the table outside, even though this report originated before I started here at the center, I think that we're in for a very good and exciting discussion with some very long-time, I was going to say old, but I said no, long-time friends of the center who have had the privilege to know and interact with over the years before officially coming on board at the center. And I want to highlight the significance of this report and sort of go back to that critical question that I had posed a little while ago. And for me, it's really a fascinating question from two perspectives. First, from an analytical perspective, I think it's an incredibly interesting topic for us to get our heads around and try to figure out. But I think it's also a good question because it relates to policies and programs. There are really some clear implications and dimensions for us to think about. And I was chatting with a couple colleagues and friends who had a look at the report and said, this is not an easy question for us to try and figure out. And as you look at the report, you will see that it highlights several potential cases of backdraft and offers recommendations on how to design conflict-sensitive mitigation and adaptation programs. And it does so really by taking a systematic look at conflict and peace, I think, and looking at that potential from a mitigation and adaptation tools and looking at sort of the analytical and policy changes that we must face head on. So as we move into the discussion, I'd like to, in particular, express appreciation for the contributions that came from a number of key partners, particularly in Berlin at Adelphi, which is directed by Alexander Karius. As leaders in the field, their contributions to the report and the analysis have been crucial and continue to be crucial to the success of the report and as we continue to roll it out. The report was originally supported by the Wilson Center's federal conference funds, but we're very grateful for the additional support of our friends and partners at USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation, particularly Cynthia Brady and Neil Levine, who made today's event possible through our Resources for Peace project. I'd also like to note that the event is being webcast live, so when we come to the discussion afterwards, I'd like to ask you to use the microphone, and my colleagues will be coming around if you have a question, and at that point we'll ask you to introduce yourself and your affiliation. Also, for those of you who are joining us and looking at us online, please send in your questions. The hashtag is Backdraft. So on that note, I'd like to start by having a longtime friend and colleague who is no stranger to the center, no stranger to many of you, to kick off the discussion. And I'll hand it over to Jeff DeBelco. And many of you know him well, and you also have his background, his bio in the materials. So Jeff?
Well, good morning, everyone. It's terrific to be back at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Thank you very much, Roger Mark. It is a tremendous honor and pleasure to have you joining the Green Team, as we call it, for the past, well, we're going on 19 years now. A role and a position that for the past 15 years I've had the privilege of having. And so it's terrific that a very good friend and longtime collaborator is joining the team here at the Wilson Center and will take it to new heights. And so thank you very much. It's an odd feeling given that sitting at this table for the last 15 years, I was just making the presentation that you did to introduce this. But it's also, as you said, not old, but longtime friends and colleagues. Thank you, Stacy. Stacy Vanderveer and Lisa Friedman. It's terrific to have them join us today. So this is an opportunity to talk about a topic that we've been grappling here with at the center for a couple years now, but finally have the opportunity to put pen to paper with a number of partners and contributors to try to get to try to make a case for essentially just yet another part of the broad climate and security agenda. And I'll talk a little bit about the space that we're trying to fill very superficially, given the diversity and the depth of the articles in there, but superficially give you a sense of some of the arguments that are being made there and making a case for why it's important to pay attention to this additional dimension of the climate and security discussion that hasn't garnered as much attention, and what we might draw from it, where we need to go from there. Like Roger Mark, I want to thank a number of people up front, including, as you'll see, the co-editors on this, Lauren Herzer, Skye Knoll, Megan Parker, and Russell Stickler, who wrestles now with our friends at the Stimson Center at their excellent environmental security program, but was here formerly. So this was a many hands project that then also includes the contributors, and I'll mention them here in the course of the presentation. So here's a book that was a project over 10 years ago called Environmental Peacemaking, or now often called Environmental Peacebuilding, where in some ways I put this up, this is an analogous effort. So many of you participated in the mid-90s, early and mid-90s, when there was this real upsurge of attention and trying to understand how environment and natural resources did or did not factor into questions of violence. And it spawned a wider discussion on redefining security, what were the roles for security institutions, but lots and lots of attention on causality. And there were a group of us, Ken Konka, who's now at American University being a leading figure, folks like Stacy Vanderveer also participating in those discussions, where it was, we're missing part of the puzzle. We're missing the environmental interdependencies and how that might be an opportunity for building trust, confidence, and peace. And so it was kind of a follow-on, a second or even third phase of the discussion, where it wasn't saying that discussion is on conflict is unimportant, certainly not saying it's settled, but that we wanted to make a contribution on an additional dimension. And so I think that's what we're trying to do here with the climate and with the backdraft argument about looking at the climate or the conflict potential of responding to climate change. So what have we been focusing on? Well, this is breaking all PowerPoint slide rules in terms of wall of text, and I have a couple of those I'll apologize for up front. But I couldn't put the picture of the storm and the drought and the disease vector changes and such. But there's a notion that we've been looking at what are expected direct impacts of climate change. So whatever we think is going to happen on increased frequency or intensity of storms and sea level rise and changes in agricultural patterns and productivity, rising sea levels, these kind of direct impacts. And that's been a focus, trying to understand what it means in a security context or conflict context. Second, the indirect. So, okay, what then does that generate? Migration is a big focus and concern, and Lisa's has a lot of experience reporting from some of the front lines of that she'll tell us about. Concern undercutting economic activity, undercutting agricultural activity, what it means for marine resources, what it means. We have a lot of folks here in the room who spend a lot of time trying to understand what is what's the new reality in the Arctic with the change in ice and transportation routes and the race for resources and such. And so that has really been a focus of attention. And where the fundamental questions were, like in the 90s, where we were looking at environment, natural resources, and how it did or didn't connect to conflict, asking some of the same questions. What are these direct and indirect climate impacts? What do they mean for conflict and wider stability questions? The wider security context, so some of these, what are the geopolitical implications in the Arctic? And then for those, including some of you here in the room, who are operating and working in traditional security institutions, what are the changed missions, changed roles, changed expectations that you're going to face and need to plan for and understand as both threat and at times opportunity, but nevertheless need to take on board. And so there are a number of leaders in that discussion here. But what we are maintaining and focusing on in this report is that those are all extremely interesting questions, ones that need to be pursued further. We don't have the answers to, and are rich and appropriate discussions that we've tried to contribute to here at the Environmental Change and Security Program and with our partners. But that, in fact, there's more to do. That as we find ways, develop ways to respond to climate change, we need to go in with our eyes open and understand that if we do, there are ways to do that well, ways to do it poorly, and if we do not get beyond our narrow kind of siloed approach to, or traditional or narrow approach to climate change, and understand that when we're doing that in a fragile state, then we have to understand the conflict context, and we can do that well and be part of a wider solution, or we can do it poorly and actually exacerbate existing lines of conflict or create ones that weren't there before. And the flip side is we need to start asking more questions about how these, say, climate adaptation interventions can be part of that larger solution, whether it's a development challenge or a peace building and conflict prevention challenge. So this is a third category then of impacts, if you will, the impacts of us responding to climate change that we need to take into account, and in fundamental ways is a pitch to work across those silos, and which, you know, we've heard many times from this platform and in this town, yet we need to get better at doing it. So in that sense, the bottom line is, first, how do we do no harm with our climate responses? Make sure we're not, as I said, creating new conflicts by what we're doing, and I'll give some examples here in a moment, or exacerbating and playing into existing ones. And then more positively, how can we be part of a solution? Looking for co-benefits in these different categories by working across the development, the peace building, and the climate. And I should say, because our climate folks and our natural resource management folks don't always talk as much as they should, you can almost break the environment into a couple categories, a climate as well as an NRM one. So some examples, and this is where it gets very kind of quick and superficial, and the richness that comes out in the different articles, because they focus on each one of these bullets, I think almost, has its own article devoted to it. The increased biofuel story is one that maybe we may have more evidence. There's certainly some of this is where we have experience to draw on. Some of it may be more of a deductive argument that, in part because we haven't been as serious as we could in terms of addressing climate change, the issues aren't there, but if we were to go further down that road, it may present challenges. But increased biofuels, this notion that, for example, Stacy will know the dates, but a couple years ago, the Europeans decide, as part of their response to climate, to mandate 10% of transportation will be biofuels by 2020. So really trying to diversify the energy source in their transportation sector. Terrific from a climate perspective. The downside and the kind of remote impact was a correspondence with doubling of palm oil prices, accelerating deforestation, and the social conflict that's associated with land use on the other side in the kind of Malaysias and Indonesias. Again, a very complex story because it correlated with higher energy prices, but the food price spikes and such, and the social conflict around food prices and such that were connected to decisions to grow our energy as part of a diversified biofuel strategy. So in that sense, these kind of unintended ripple effects that do have implications in what we might call a broad set of conflict contexts. The increased third country land purchasing or leasing, often called land grabs, I would commend to you an excellent whole volume on this from our colleague here at the Wilson Center, Michael Kugelman, who is who's focused a whole book on it. We have a short piece on this as well, but in a sense that it becomes a rational response, whether it's from water insecurity in a warmer world for food insecure countries who are wealthy to buy up and lease land in third countries, and what that means in the social context there. And I think the dissertation yet to be written is figuring out exactly what role the South Korean rice deal in Madagascar played in bringing people into the streets in the Malagasy coup a few years ago. I think there are a lot of things that are going on there, but that certainly was part of the proximate rallying cry in the streets that brought down Ravlomanana. But also that it is, as we are putting value on forests in the payment for ecosystem services, this land speculation and buying up to garner carbon credits. And we've already seen kind of criminal court cases in Europe regarding that, where, again, the good idea gets abused in ways that are challenging in conflict contexts and local contexts, but raise larger questions for the climate response. And the increased payments for forest set-asides, this often under this rubric of RED, reduced emissions from forest degradation and deforestation, RED+, a tremendously important and creative tool for putting value on forests and keeping them as carbon sinks, keeping those forests standing because they have value in ways that, if you just look at it as timber, that they don't. But if you're going to change land access and you're going to put money into the system, that can be done well or that can be done poorly. And we may have greater faith in the institutions in country X versus country Y. And certainly some of the big advocates are some of the countries that have some of the biggest challenges on transparency and corruption and such. And so raises real question about whether those people in the forest who are going to be displaced by this, or at least have their access changed, whether they're going to see some of these benefits. This is one where we are, in many respects, it's early enough to go in with our eyes open, because we haven't done as much of this, in part because the price of carbon credits is so low at the moment. But we do have, with some cases in Tanzania, for example, you can see in a piece of Global Environmental Change from a year or two ago, where the system was abused, and you do have some of these conflict, really local or center periphery conflicts that are a real challenge for us going forward, and we want to make sure we avoid those in future. Increased hydro, this is the kind of classic case of displacement of large populations, so it's more of a wider structural violence rather than end-of-the-gun violence. But nevertheless, if we're going to have this broader understanding of diversifying our energy resources and going with renewables away from a carbon economy, this is likely to, is being part of the response, right? And we have to understand that that's something we have to take into account. And even solar has some, even greens pitted against greens, or wind, the same thing. I was shocked last summer to hear how vociferous the NIMBY response in Vermont was to windmills and just how they hated them. And as someone married to a Dane, where windmills are kind of part of the landscape, again, this is conflict of a different kind, but nevertheless ones that we need to find a way to embrace this and bring it in early, rather than just assuming this green, all will sing kumbaya on this transition to a green economy. And then finally, increased nuke is a familiar concern around loose nukes, and if we're going that route, what's that mean in terms of the traditional threats that might be accompanied by those used as weapons, as well as, of course, from an environmental perspective, the disposal of the waste. So those are a laundry list. Two more that are associated, but in some ways a little different, and Stacy will address the strategic minerals question, but this notion of, well, in our old energy economy, we certainly have plenty of experience around the notion that the Nigerias, the Angolas, the Sudans, the countries, Venezuelas, that are heavily dependent on fossil fuels, the Middle East, number of Middle Eastern countries, that there are often, not necessarily, but often real resource or governance, challenges associated with them in ways that really have us asking the question, what is the new strategic minerals list in a green economy? Are there the potentials for similar or analogous resource curse dynamics that may or may not be part of wider instability or significant governance challenges? And the rare earths question comes up there, certainly the lithium questions, but there's some familiar ones that Stacy really will address with a much greater depth of knowledge. And then finally, we put the geoengineering question there. So because we are having such challenges, shall we say, with our current institutions in addressing carbon, I think we will see an increased temptation to go to the almost, from my perspective, the perceived get out of jail free card, which is these massive technological interventions into the atmosphere or the oceans in ways that certainly the discussion around the 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review, the folks coming around town talking to people about the wide set of energy and climate issues, they said the one thing that people wanted to talk about the most was geoengineering, in part because some wanted the military to deploy it because they'd just given up on our public institutions to address carbon, and climate was so important we had to do it, and others saying, for goodness sake, you're the only ones who can interdict and stop these crazies from doing the geoengineering. So kind of both kinds, the security institutions had a major role, entirely different ones as perceived, but nevertheless one that we have little to no international norms, let alone laws, all sorts of challenges around low barrier to entry, and something that can be part of this agenda. So moving forward, I first, of course, had this table of contents slide up front, and I was going to walk you through all these, but in part, then I'd do it again by talking about the substance of it. Here is our table of contents. As Roger Mark rightly said up front, our friends and colleagues and longtime collaborators at Adelphi Research in Berlin have multiple contributions in this. Dennis Tensler, Alex Karius, and Achim Maas, the need for conflict-sensitive adaptation is one of those pieces. Dennis's piece on red, forest and conflict and relevance of red, and Achim Maas and Arina Kamerdic, who's actually a former student of mine, also both formerly at Adelphi, contributing an article on the geoengineering dimension. So Adelphi features prominently in this. But we have Dr. Stacy Vanderveer, who's going to talk about the resource curses. We also have Christian Webersek and Michael Bergouet talking about the biofuels transition. And then finally, in part as a concluding notion of trying to start thinking about how we think differently about these issues and some tools for understanding how these challenges really test some of our traditional models for understanding them. Chad Briggs, who many of you know, has done work from various posts with the Air University and some positions in Toronto, some positions in Europe, but kind of most importantly, working here in town at Department of Energy on these issues, has a concluding piece that looks at some of the traditional security institutions' role playing in scenario and risk analysis that gives us some tools to use for responding to this. All of these pieces, as of this morning, are now available and online, and urge you to pick those up. So to bring it to a close, why should we take this seriously? I think there's a real danger in us being misperceived as saying, you know, hold back on this response to climate change because, oh my goodness, it might cause conflict. When in fact it's exactly the opposite. It's because that transition to a green economy and taking reduction of carbon seriously and making this transition is so very important. We think it's critical to have these issues on the table up front. Because if we don't, and we have more, and we pretend to be surprised when some of these interventions unwittingly or unexpectedly create problems in these other dimensions of conflict, then we really run the risk of undercutting both the larger rationale for making this transition as well as potentially delegitimizing or undercutting specific tools for how to do it. And so if we do it poorly with these tools, because we didn't take into account these wider issues, then we're actually setting back the effort. So it is one that embraces the importance of the transition, and it says because it's so important, we have to take on some of these complex issues ahead of time. And then, of course, what these essays don't address as much as we'd like, but we see as a future research agenda, the potential for the peace-building dimensions as well as the threats of conflict. So 2 slides on takeaways. Got to go in with our eyes open and not kind of eyes open with peripheral vision to understand how climate interventions are going to be received and impact these other sectors. They can be done well or they can be done poorly, and we have to consider that not just in ecological terms or economic terms, but also in conflict and peace-building terms. We need a systematic, conflict-sensitive climate interventions, and I do think there's some progress here. Roger Mark mentioned Cynthia Brady at USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation. Her office, and we've been fortunate to work with them, are really trying to develop some of these principles. So if you have a proposed climate intervention, you can apply some questions up front to see whether you anticipate these issues may come to the fore. Also, I'd say from learning from our partners, Alexander Carius, a number of the European bilaterals are asking some of these same questions, as are, of course, a variety of NGOs who are seeing this on the ground in some of their implementation. Then finally, as I said, it requires us to get out of our silos. It means that some folks where you say, well, is this really a proper or traditional actor in a climate discussion? Why is this person at the table? That we have to be open to a broader set of people at the table having something to say that is relevant. We can't leave it just to a narrow notion of lawyers and ecologists. It has to be a broader one. That a research agenda that this publication does not address, but we plan to and want to, which is turning it on its head again, like we did with environmental peacemaking, and ask how can we capture some of these co-benefits. So if we're doing climate adaptation strategies in Eastern Congo, how can we advance the development and the peace building side as well? Because we've also seen conflict is a real a drag, so to speak, on the ability to adapt to climate change. And so we have to understand these things together. And then finally, the history is yet to be written in some sense. The premise for why these may be issues is the saying, well, as we get serious about addressing climate change, some may stop you right there and say we're not serious. But in that sense, a number of these interventions are yet to be made. And so we have the luxury of saying, well, let's take these things into account as we do it, rather than react after we've done it and try to fix some of the problems. And so in that sense, some of these we have some evidence to look at. Some of it are deductive arguments, but I would say, particularly in the policy context where we're trying to apply these, that's actually an advantage that we can go into it with our eyes open. So, Roger Mark, thank you very much. Look forward to the next.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for that great framing of the discussion, sort of reminding us of the context of do no harm and looking at a solution-oriented approach with co-benefits, and sort of making some mention of biofuels, land grabs, strategic minerals, geoengineering, as well as a number of issues, and sort of ultimately highlighting the opportunity that we have here, sort of recognizing that we must move to a green economy, that there's a rationale and support for this, and that it really is a unique opportunity for peace building. So thank you, Jeff. Let's move on to our second speaker, Stacy van der Veers, an associate professor of political science at the University of New Hampshire. A number of research interests, including international environmental policy making and its domestic impacts, the role of expertise in policy making in the politics of consumption, environment and human rights degradation in global commodities markets, as a long list of articles, book chapters, working papers, and reports. So, Stacy, we look forward to your discussion of resource curses.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. It's great to be back at the Wilson Center. So you're about to see some exceptionally graphically boring slides. You should know that they are just words on a white field right now. And so the piece is called, so I'm going to talk about, as you know in this report, there are about 7 pieces, and one of them is mine, and I'm going to talk primarily about mine. But I would encourage you to really take a look at the entire report. I'm really pleased and honored to be part of it. It's a lot of great stuff. So consider mine the mining flavor, but there are, as Jeff pointed out, a host of other things in the report. So the piece is called Resource Curses, Redux, Ex Post, or Ad Infinitum. In other words, I'm trying to sort of grapple with the relationship of this ongoing discussion about the resource curses, the challenges of the resource curse, or whether it exists at all, and its relationship to the green economy. I spent the last academic year here in DC at a place called the Transatlantic Academy, which is at the German Marshall Fund. 2 of my fellow colleagues are here today, and so I would like to thank all of them for lots of great research support and learning. Now, the way I sort of approached this after a while was to think about where the green economy is. This is one of the things to ask ourselves is, what is this green economy and where is it? And for the most part, I think you won't be surprised to learn, the green economy is just the global economy. And because the green economy is just part, or in fact the same thing in some respects as the global economy, it isn't very green. And it also, it turns out, isn't particularly generous to workers and doesn't engage in very much high-quality supply chain management. So I'm going to use mining as an example of that. And really, I think the takeaway is that we can't talk about a green economy or green technologies or green energies by only talking about a set of technologies that are being stamped out at one end of a large global process and then deployed for cleaner energy. The green economy or cleaner energy transition requires a lot of technology. And it requires a lot of hardware and a lot of software. So any of the environmental and labor rights challenges present in the economy overall are present in the green economy. And actually, more to the point, it requires a lot of metals and a whole bunch of things, all kinds of things that are mined. And so, as we were saying beforehand, I came late to the sort of mining issue. My other work was for years on general environmental cooperation institutions. And so I never tired of reminding people that in the 90s and even into the early 2000s, mining was an old, dirty industry, very emblematic of the 20th century, the sort of thing that was going out of fashion. And then it turned out that as the booms happened in parts of the developing world, and because of a lot of high-tech equipment and electronic equipment, mining boomed. It's a very sexy industry, and not only is it a very sexy industry, it's huge now. So we speak about a mining industry that the sector itself is larger than about 150 countries' GDPs. So we're speaking about a damn big sector. And it is quite global. It is also extremely complex in terms of its ownership and control structure. There are a small-ish number of very large multinational firms. And then there are tens of thousands of mines, and mostly they are not owned and controlled outright by single mining companies, but by a whole very complex chain of ownership, production, and transportation and consumption and processing. In this sense, for a little jargon, all of this green economy and its mining connections are very much emblematic of what in the jargon is known as the post-Fordist economy. The extremely complex multinational economy that travels great distances geographically, but also includes sort of spaces, political and social spaces that are very distant from those that we know. And I can talk more about that if we want. Commodity markets, of the things that mined, just like most commodity markets for the last 300 years, are boom and bust prone. And that means that they have all of the social, political, and economic ramifications of boom and bust commodities of other kinds. Many of those are not terribly positive. Now, Lastly, I'll say just a little bit about things about mining that you probably know. But because of the scale of the industry now, the scale of the environmental change and social change being driven by mining globally is actually quite stunning. And mining, so you can look at pictures online. There are some in the report of the scale of a modern, contemporary corporate mine, just really quite stunning in their scale and their ability to change regional and local environments. And then you've got a whole lot of artisanal or local scale mining. But in many parts of the world, this artisanal local scale mining takes place at such a giant scale in a particular area that you're also transforming a whole region. So that if you're say mining for coltan and you're digging pits that are 20 by 20 and digging through them to find the coltan, it turns out if there are thousands and thousands of those pits, you have again reached a kind of scale that's quite shocking. So how does this connect to the resource curse? As many of you know, the resource curse, I think, is best defined as an observed correlation or a set of observed correlations between national resource wealth and poor economic performance and ineffective government. And I use the word correlation because part of the whole idea of whether or not oil is a curse or some of the other commodity, commodity exporters and resource wealth leads to a curse. There's a rich debate, right, in the literature about what is causing these observed correlations. And like many things, trying to understand global politics and global economy, the answers don't turn out to be particularly simple. And so I can go into that for those of you who are interested, but I think that the more important thing to draw is that we know that there are a substantial, several dozen countries that are very heavily dependent on a commodity exporting of one or two or three commodities. And we know that in general, being dependent economically on commodity exports, in general, it means that you are poor and likely to remain poorer in the global economy. There are exceptions to this, and it's important to study them, but it's the general rule. The boom and bust cycles have social and economic ramifications in many of the exporting countries, and the poor governance very often takes the form of kind of patron-client networks of governance, so that you've got a lot of sometimes fairly standard corruption. Sometimes those patron-client networks are reinforced by the use of force by the state or by a militia or other local groups. But very often, the patron-client networks are simply maintained over time by the transfer of resources, as we say very generously in political science, which is to say people are paying other people to sustain the social structure. When we look at the research drawing generally on the resource curse, what you get is that the answer is not the problem, or the central answer to this set of problems is not that the presence of a wealthy or expensive resource is by itself a curse, but that we're talking about a problem of institutional configurations. And those institutions, of those governance institutions, can be problematic in the exporting state, in the consuming states, in multinational firms, international organizations. So the other thing I think to remember about these resource curse challenges is that it is easy to fall into the trap of saying that if these exporting countries were better governed, that is, if they could put their houses in order, these things would change. The challenge of the resource curse dynamics is that money flows in from the outside in massive quantities. Nigeria is one of the classic examples, and there are many more. And so we turn our attention in this research and in the kind of ongoing policy making about that to the set of institutions that are both domestic and international, some of them public, some of them private. And I can, if people are interested in the work, I can talk more about it, but I'm thinking of the work of Michael Ross and Erica Weinthal and a number of others who have been working on these issues for quite some time on the analytical side. So my paper includes four sort of examples of trying to connect the not very green economy to the global economy and the well-documented problems in a global economy. And so I called attention to the coltan issue, lithium, the rare earths geopolitics, as I call it, and then a little attention to what direction for the petrostates. I invite you to read it. I'm not going to go through all 4 of these examples in detail, but I want to tell you just a little bit about what I sort of tried to draw, or the sort of moral of the story of these 4 exemplary vignettes in the piece. For me, coltan, this metal highly prized for its use in electronic equipment, is a great boom and bust story. And it's the ramifications of a boom and bust dynamics in a place that already has political and economic instability and challenges and already had violence. The coltan boom of the late 90s and early 2000s, the price went from about $30 a pound up to about $300 a pound, and then when the price collapsed, it collapsed again to about $30 a pound over the course of about 3 or 4 years. When we talk about a tenfold increase in price from $31 or $2 to upwards of $300 a pound, it turned out, economists are great about this part of the story, it turned out, right, that people rushed into the coltan market, and for parts of the Eastern Congo and a few other places in the world, that means that all you really need is a strong back and some shovels. Because coltan in some places can be found very close to the surface. It can be found in national parks, it can be found in wildlife preserves, it can be found in the local water source, it can be found where cattle are also grazing, and you just start digging. And so you see this massive boom with a lot of local environmental ramifications, very negative impacts on human health, both of the people doing the work and of people in the local communities. But for the broader story, you also see that what developed very quickly were, with so much money at stake, were a lot of patron-client relationships, a lot of money flowing into the illicit movement of coltan, a lot of money being converted from mining to weapons buying, a lot of mining money being converted into the kind of capital you use to sustain local control and to acquire the means of violence to sustain local control. So funding militias, funding all kinds of localized violence, and a lot of damage in local communities. My colleague Raymond Bleichwitz is here. He and some of his colleagues from Wuppertal published a piece last year estimating that even now, about 10 years later, 20% or so of the coltan in the global market is illicit. So when we're talking about 20% of things on the market being illicit or smuggled, we are not talking about an incidental kind of percentage, and that means that actually the illicit coltan is in some ways driving whatever the global price may be. But the interesting thing for the longer term is that after the boom busted, and the kind of coltan money no longer flows to the Eastern DRC in massive quantities, what it means is that in the wake of those relationships, the relationships established around all that money persist, so that people who were exchanging coltan money for weapons began to exchange tin mining money for weapons and everything else. So that the legacy itself is a set of social relations which continue to be extremely brutal in the region, and they can extend to all kinds of other mined commodities and other sorts of commodities altogether. That part, the governance challenge and those networks once established on the basis of a lot of money and quite a bit of violence, they then persist. Even though coltan goes out of fashion, violence and money do not go out of fashion. And so you get a kind of reconstruction of these sorts of curse dynamics on all kinds of commodities from the region. And we know that we can talk about the sort of ongoing attempts to grapple with that inside and outside of the Congo if we want. But I think for me, the coltan story is a boom and bust story, and it's about the legacies of boom and busts. That after coltan leaves the news and the activists have moved on to other things, the legacy of those vicious politics persists in more violence and in persistent bad governance. The lithium story has to do with the potential because of the large reserves of lithium in Bolivia, the potential to accelerate and the Bolivian resource curse dynamics. And a lot of the signs point in this direction, so that the state has asserted total control over lithium. There are state-established institutions, and in fact, you can take the money that Bolivian state already makes from oil and invest it in and invest it in the lithium production. So as lithium demand grows, if it grows substantially in the years to come, as it may well, you can see that you can take money from one set of resource curse dynamics based on oil, and you can use it to try to create a dominant global position in lithium. The rare earth story, many of you in Washington know well, I think, but the rare earths set of metals that became so controversial in 2010 and 11 when Chinese officials began to constrain the exports and therefore curtail supply. It was often reported that China is home to 97 or so percent of rare earths. That was not true. But what it was is what it did dominate almost exclusively was the processing of rare earths. So they can be mined. They are not that rare. They are all over the world. They can be mined and are mined in a lot of places. But China had the dominant position in processing. And why? Why the dominant position in processing? Because the standards for processing were extremely low, probably also subsidized, so that in fact it wasn't, in our international relations literature, we would look for nefarious purposes. Ah, these Chinese, we would say, in realist international politics, right? You can hear it all the time in Washington. They have decided to use rare earths to make us dependent on them and therefore use that dependence against us. It's a fantastic plan and plot. In fact, we see it's the much more benign global economy explanation. The processing was cheapest there. The environmental standards were cheap. The industry was very poorly regulated. It wasn't particularly even controlled at all by the state, but by actually local interests, the state. And in fact, when the supply was constrained, it appears primarily that was constrained by the national government because the national government is trying to assert control of an industry over which it has lost total environment, labor, economic taxation, and all kinds of other sorts of controls. The industry boomed, the state didn't have control, so they asserted control. What happens? Well, we got a lot of international relations debate about them, about the role of the Chinese state in the global economy. There was pretty quick US, EU, and Japanese cooperation. There was a lot of rhetoric around the international security concerns, particularly in Japan and the US. And wrapped in security rhetoric, it turns out that we engaged in Washington in the thing that in words that we aren't supposed to utter publicly, but we engaged in industrial policy. Pretty just nakedly, right? Work with Europeans and other Japanese to figure out how to get more mines open, how to get processing up and running that's outside of China. Full-on industrial policy to match this sort of perceived economic security threat. And then lastly, the last sort of very brief sort of box example is just the question of what happens if we are successful at curbing oil use in the years to come. What happens to the petrostates? And in my view, the answer will be many different things will happen to the petrostates, but it doesn't at all appear likely that they'll all become Norway, right? That you're going to ride the decline of North Sea oil into the future of a gorgeous sovereign fund and one of the wealthiest societies on earth. That mostly is not happening. We can look to Yemen and see what happens when a state and a society in crisis has declining export revenues and declining oil revenues, becomes less and less able to provide basic things for a society that's already in crisis. And so we've got the Yemen versus Norway sorts of paths to the future, and I would submit to you that the Yemeni one looks more likely in some places. And I was reminded when Mrs. Thatcher passed a few weeks ago, and there were, as you all remember, right, there was all this fantastic American coverage about the glorious special relationship, Mrs. Thatcher, and lots of shock in the American media that people would take to the streets singing the song "We'll Dance in the Streets the Day Thatcher Died" and other kinds of classics from the 1980s. This was regarded in American political culture, right, as so gauche, right, to dance on the grave of Mrs. Thatcher. But I would remind you of the miners' strikes, right? I would remind you what happens when you use the state to totally end the economic lifestyle for hundreds of thousands of people. In a state that was compared to the number of the oil exporting states, quite a bit better functioning than some of those. So I think if we think about the decline of coal and the local and sometimes full-on national violence that it has induced over places, and we ask ourselves about the decline of oil, which we very desperately need P.S. the decline of oil, but we aren't thinking nearly enough about what it will mean for the petrostates in the world. So the bumper stickers at the end. In my view, without focused attention on where the stuff of the green economy or the energy transition comes from, greening the resource curse is the most likely outcome if we don't stop and ask ourselves what we need to be doing differently. As I note here, the green economy ain't green if it's really just products, green products in the regular global economy, because the regular global economy ain't very green. And so we have to reflect on what we know about the structure of the global economy, about where the basic resources in the global economy come from, and if all we're concerned about is deploying, bringing down the price and deploying solar and other kinds of new technologies at the end, without thinking about the economic stream and the stream of production behind them, we are going to reproduce these curses. I have other work and relying on many other fantastic researchers on a set of initiatives about what's going on to address aspects of the resource curse, some state-led options for regulation, trade, and all kinds of other options, and then some non-state options about activism, pushing of transparency, and I'm happy to talk about those, but we'll leave you there with the curse well greened. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Stacy, leaving us with the curse well greened. And I would say, even though he threatened us with some exceptionally boring slides, I want to thank him for an exceptionally interesting presentation. So really walking us through this sense of what it means to think of a cleaner energy transition, recognizing sort of the size of the sector in a post-Fordist distancing, walking us through questions around the the resource curse, looking at coltan, lithium, rare earth, and petrostates, and sort of leaving us with a challenge of greening the resource curse. So I'm quite intrigued to see how Lisa thinks about her thoughts on pulling all of this together. As many of you know, Lisa Friedman is the deputy editor of Climate Wire, helping to lead a team of 10 reporters covering the business and politics of climate change. She's covered a number of dimensions of this topic, including international policy, looking at the global climate change negotiations and the intersection between climate, security, and development. The line that I like best in her bio is, in the pursuit of those stories, she has gone to the bottom of a Chinese coal mine, sat with families in flood-ravaged villages in Bangladesh, and climbed the snow-capped Himalayan mountains. So with that perspective, Lisa is going to share with us her thoughts and perspectives on Backdraft. Lisa?
Thank you so much. Is this on? I'm going to sit here and talk. Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here and to be sitting with researchers like Jeff, for one, that is someone that I call on when I need to some perspective and someone to explain the complicated and nuanced issues that I cover, and Stacy, who I intend to call on, and a lot of people that I see in the room that I also call on as well. And so it's great to be on this side of the podium to be able to reflect on this report, which I think is in a lot of ways groundbreaking, and share a little bit of the experiences that I've had reporting in this space. Just briefly about Climate Wire, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, as Roger said, we're an energy policy magazine based here in DC. We cover all aspects of climate policy. We have reporters who cover Congress, obviously, technology, science. I cover international issues. It's a mix of the UN climate negotiations, and really I tend to write a lot about what climate change means for vulnerable countries. As part of which, yes, I did climb part of the Himalayas. And as I was telling Stacy earlier, I mean, you could probably tell by looking at me, I'm not really a mountain climber girl. It was awful. I thought I was going to die. I mean, it was amazing, but I thought I was going to die every single moment of every day. But the issue that got me started on this was really the issue of migration. And, we started, I had been a reporter for California Papers for many years covering immigration and immigration policy here in Washington. And as I moved to Climate Wire and started covering some of the international challenges, the issue of migration is one that really popped out to me. And I wanted to start with Bangladesh because at the time, most of the reporting on the issue of climate migration was focused on the small island nations. And it was, I want to be careful how I say this because I think my perspective is very different now than it was then. I think my perspective at the time was simplistic. I felt that the stories about the small island nations were pretty straightforward stories, right? Sea levels rise, people have to leave. And I think that, at this point we're doing a series of stories at Climate Wire on the challenges that islands face as they try to adapt. And I see obviously that it's a far more complicated story. But at the time, what I wanted to look at was what does this talk that I'm hearing about as climate change is a threat multiplier. What does that mean in a really complicated country? I wanted to take a country like Bangladesh because it had, a huge population, hundreds of millions of people living in a country the size of Iowa, poor infrastructure, poor civic infrastructure, and really get a sense of how climate change is pulling at the strings of a very complicated society. What I noticed going in and what to me makes this paper so striking is as recently as 2008, when I did that series, I would say that the body of academic research on climate migration was pretty, I don't know if thin is the right word, but it was very hard for me to find good, solid information about this issue. There were environmental experts, and there were people who dealt with migration. And they didn't seem to be working together, or at least a very few were. There's that wonderful woman at Georgetown whose name I'm forgetting, but and a few others that I was able to reach out to. But for the most part, I would say that even the IMO, the International Migration Organization, when I met with them in Bangladesh, was not really focused on this issue of climate migration. You had, the discussion was really centered upon this old sort of crude notion that sea levels will rise X amount and these people living in these areas will, that are threatened by sea level rise will leave. And as I talked to people in this other world who dealt with demographics and migration, they would tell me, well, no, that's not how people move. That's not why people move. People are pushed and people are pulled. People move because they suffer from earthquakes and fleeing war, and they move because of jobs, and opportunities. And my grandparents, right? I mean, one grandparent on one side fled persecution in Poland, the other grandparent on another side met a family whose daughter was pretty and moving to America, and and he found a way to follow there. So pushed and pulled. And what I found in Bangladesh was very similar. It wasn't a straight line. People were moving certainly because, saline intrusion, for example, into rice fields were turning a lot of the rice fields into shrimp farming. Shrimp farming is a much harder industry for the communities to survive in. There were fewer jobs, harder to get, less money. People were moving, because of flooding. At the same time, there were also good construction jobs and other jobs in India, but also in more urban parts of Bangladesh. And that's one of the areas that I wanted to come back to. When we talk about these, potential for international conflicts, one of the things that stood out to me in my reporting was sort of my own bias as a reporter. To me, the sexy story was, this possibility of transboundary, the potential for conflicts between countries. India building a fence to keep out, a rising number of Bengalis. When a real issue within Bangladesh, I found, is the number of people in Bangladesh who are having to leave coastal areas for cities. coastal areas in Shatkhira district where I was for DACA. Again, pushed and pulled, both because of flooding and because of, H&M and Walmart and a growing, growing number of jobs, urbanization throughout Asia and other parts of the world that are pushing people towards cities. This sort of internal migration is something that I think doesn't get a lot of attention from the news media, and I think that that's a challenge to sort of keep up here for us. I think that as it's hard because newspapers have no resources, and who's covering these things anyway? A small and declining number of reporters as it is. But I think the challenge remains to explain to people not just the sort of big stories of potentials for thousands of people to be leaving one country and going to another, and the conflicts that might produce, but why does it matter to Ohio or any other place if people leave coastal areas of a desperately poor country and move to an urban area, and you see slums exploding and an already burdened infrastructure less able to handle this population, and the potential for more conflicts to arise within a country? How does that affect others? How does that affect that country? The other area that I think I wanted to point out was that when I went to Bangladesh, again, it's not that long ago, and it feels like it was because nobody was interested in talking about climate migration in the Bangladesh government, or academics in Bangladesh. As I spoke to folks, throughout the country, I was told this isn't an issue for right now. This isn't happening. Well, first of all, there's a whole sensitivity around migration, there. The Bangladesh government, the Indian government says there's about 10 million illegal Bengalis coming to India every year. The Bangladesh government says there are 0, so one has to assume the real number's somewhere in the middle there. The Bangladesh government, when I spoke to people, repeatedly said, this isn't an issue right now. What we have to focus on is building dams, building infrastructure, dealing with food security. Maybe this is an issue in a century, but not now. 2 years later, might have been less than 2 years later, when the foreign secretary was in Washington, I interviewed her, and the prospect of climate migration from her country to others was at the top of her list of things to talk about when it came to climate change. Maybe it was because there was a new government. Maybe it was because there is a greater interest and study and focus that is promoting, interest in these issues, and the government is listening. The cynical journalist part of me says there's a lot of money here, or potentially. If there's supposed to be a green climate fund that may or may not come into being at the size that it is expected and hoped to be. The international, through the UN process, countries are devising a fund that many would like to see come to the level of $100 billion a year. Right now, it's still an empty shell. Regardless, there is a lot of money floating out there for addressing climate change, and I think that maybe both as an academic and certainly as a reporter, the caution that I would put out there is within countries is genuine. Is there enough study and focus and and deep understanding of some of the issues, or is there simply a rush to get money to deal with an issue that has not yet been fully explored and the implications fully explored? That brings me back around to this paper, which I think is really one of the first, if not the first, that I've seen that starts to look at some of the unintended consequences of adaptation. And I think that all of these issues that are explored in here are fantastic ones. I think that it's going to be our responsibility as journalists to do the boots on the ground reporting, to understand if money is being used wisely in countries, and if the structure is there to help countries prepare for the myriad of challenges that they're going to be facing. I'm going to stop here because I think the meat of the discussion is really with you two, and if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to answer them. But I think I'll leave it for there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Lisa. And I would say, even though you think of yourself not as this typical mountain climber girl, appreciate that you're willing to sort of step out of your silos and look at the broader implications of these important questions. And I would say, as someone who is originally from a small island nation and someone who's done a lot of work in Bangladesh, I appreciated your pulling those issues together in that way. I was also pleased to hear you say that you intend to continue calling on Jeff. As you know, we at the Wilson Center continue to engage folks in academia, and Jeff, in his new position as a Director of Environmental Studies at the George V. Vanovich School of Leadership and Public Affairs at Ohio University, serves as an important resource. And I didn't know, wasn't quite sure whether Stacy was aware we were setting him up for further calls from you, Lisa. So that's a good thing. But for reminding us of sort of what's the human face and dimension of these kinds of stories, what makes a good story, and how do we really focus and get a deep understanding of the different ramifications of these kinds of issues. So let's open up the floor and have an engaging discussion. My colleagues will come to you with a microphone, and once again, please introduce yourself and give your affiliation. So the back of the room here, thank you.
Cheryl Wasserman, Environmental Protection Agency. Hi. I have a question for Stacy, and that has to do with the absence of supply chain responsibility and what you think the prognosis is for the Dodd-Frank provision on conflict minerals has on even making a modicum of change in this process. Thank you.
Should we take them?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, so first, the optimistic side of the story for me on the Dodd-Frank provisions on conflict minerals. Some of you may know the Dodd-Frank, the Financial Services Act, 2010 included some provisions pushing for transparency of sourcing of materials, so-called conflict minerals, and some other reporting requirements. So in my view, the good news is that that some of those clauses making their way into the Dodd-Frank Act have meant that the goal of furthering transparency of where things come from and under what conditions they are produced or mined. The transparency is the kind of transparency revolution pushed mostly over 15 years of great work by a lot of international NGOs is moving farther into the state and public regulations. So certainly the Dodd-Frank inclusion in the Dodd-Frank has also engendered a response in Brussels, in the Commission, some ongoing Commission proposals to push firms that are publicly listed firms in Europe to also do some source reporting. It may well be that a larger set of sectors is included in the European version. So that's, for me, the general transparency revolution about financial flows and about the origins of things and the conditions under which they are produced is one of the most positive directions in the last few years. the Dodd-Frank specifics are much less easy to be solely optimistic about. In part because it seems to me that that the pushback from some parts of industry and from some parts of our politics has been so strenuous and so persistent and so well funded that I am not sure yet at all what the ultimate outcome of the reporting requirements will be, either for or in the Congo, which is one of the clauses specifically mentions, or more broadly. Now, the last thing I'll say about that, though, is that there is a big debate among activists about whether or not the use of regulations to push transparency is too blunt of an instrument, because the short-term solution for a lot of firms is, rather than figure out how to abide these requirements, is to simply stop exporting or stop importing things from the DRC altogether. And I must say that I'm less, it's easy for me to sit in Washington and say this, but I'll say it anyway. I'm less squishy about that as a short-term problem, because it seems to me that the intention of Western importer state regulation is to change the incentives for domestic actors. So if the folks who want to make money in Eastern Congo want to make money by exporting things legally, they need actually to change some things about their own governance and their behaviors. Now, do I want that to be participatory and less bluntly driven from Brussels and Washington? Yes, I do. But I think actually we can't get squishy about the fact, or all soft about the fact that that these kinds of institutional changes take time, and that the very folks who are making money in regions where mining is the most brutal and the most connected to violence, their incentives have to change. Their access to global market, in my view, ought to be conditional on certain types of behaviors and the upholding of certain standards. And so when you leverage market access to increase standards elsewhere, that's exactly what you're doing. You're leveraging market access to increase standards elsewhere.
Yeah, Hugh Haskell from the Institute of Energy and Environmental Research for Lisa. You mentioned the studies of island nations in this context, and it occurred to me that we have I think a really interesting laboratory example of an island nation, and that's the Marshall Islands, which were affected by the nuclear weapons tests in the 50s, and especially the diaspora of the Bikinians, that might be worthwhile looking at in the context of the climate change to see some of the effects that can happen. I wonder if you know of any effort that's being done in that direction.
Sure. Well, thank you. I mean, as it happens, I'm going to the Marshall Islands in September. They're hosting the Pacific Island Forum, I think it's called, which is going to be very heavily focused on climate change. They've been, Marshall Islands has been, I think, at the forefront of some really interesting work on particularly the legal aspects of climate change. They helped spearhead research that was done at Columbia University, I think, looking at questions like, if a country ceases to exist, does it still get a seat at the UN? What happens to fishing rights and other issues. On the question of migration, I think that one issue that's starting to be explored, and I'm not quite as familiar with this one, even though I'm going to mention it anyway because we're working on it. There was a conference recently in Hawaii that one of our reporters was at, and one of the issues that came up was the growing number of Micronesian immigrants in Hawaii. Micronesian immigrants are the largest growing number it's the largest growing immigrant community in Hawaii. There are a number of tensions, as there are with any growing new group of immigrants in a community. Is it a climate change story? I think there's a lot of debate right now. And I think it goes back to the push and pull. People are moving to Hawaii for a number of reasons, including the fact that it's most like the places that they came from. There's job opportunities where there are no longer in their homes. But why are there no more? Why are there a declining number of job opportunities? Because of increasing storm surges, and also, on the other end, droughts like we're seeing right now in the Marshall Islands, which is suffering several months of an extreme drought that is threatening their water supply and their food security. I'm pretty sure it was either a state of disaster or a state of emergency that was declared just recently for the country.
Roger Mark, can I just add, one of the best people to read on this topic is John Barnett. John, without an H, Barnett, from University of Melbourne, a geographer. Has written and edited books on small island states and climate within this broader security context, and has some very innovative ideas for addressing it that in some ways, to me, illustrate this notion of how we need to think beyond what we traditionally focus on as a climate intervention. And so he talks a lot about the movement of people within their traditional patterns of migration, and so looking at how those patterns of migration make sense in terms of remittances and such, and so different small island states having strengths in providing nursing or providing sailors, and then having, in part, the way to deal with the stresses and their own vulnerability is, in fact, to facilitate ways that they can become stronger in those sectors and have greater remittances and then greater ability to adapt. It's not in any way a mitigation solution to the larger existential threat, but nevertheless, it's the kind of conversations we need to have that are not going to typically come up in your traditional climate meeting, and requires a much broader set of actors at the table from a public and a private sector perspective.
Yes, please, at the back of the room.
Hi there, I'm Kame Westerman with Conservation International. I wanted to ask the entire panel, really, about gender sensitivity in terms of climate change adaptation projects, interventions. We're not probably doing enough to make sure that both men and women are equally sharing benefits and costs of these interventions, and what do you think we should be doing to ensure that that's the case?
You should answer that question. Roger Mark on the panel is the one who's done the most on that. So
I'd love to hear what you guys say, and then I can add.
Well, I'll jump in so Roger can tell me where I've gone way wrong. I think it's a fascinating question, of course, in terms of what's happening and what should be happening differently. But I'll put it this way. We've had 30 years in the development community of thinking and rethinking what is the role of gender and whether, in particular, rural women are treated as subject or objects of various kinds of development goals, patterns, and schemes. And my view is that a lot of the folks in climate adaptation did not come from the development community. Many of them are scientists. And they have lots of scientific and technical training. And the bringing together of the decades of expertise in development around really thinking and rethinking issues of gender and getting that more mainstreamed into the climate change adaptation, which can be a heavily technocratic crowd and a heavily technocratic discourse about things that need to be built and plans that need to be made. And it's all very large scheme and modernizing in a way that terrifies many folks in the development, on the development side. And so my response would be that we need more forums to connect the decades of experience in development around gender to the adaptation organizations, schemes, and experts, because my hunch and my very limited experience confirms the hunch that is not yet happening.
I'm not going to let you off the hook. 'Cause I learned half of what I know from you on this.
So, and I think, thank you for the question. Okay, as you know very well, there are a number of initiatives globally that are really looking at a gender perspective on climate change adaptation. A lot of researchers and advocates and policymakers and program managers in countries like Malawi, Kenya, Bangladesh are actually looking at climate change adaptation policies and looking at their general population policies and finding opportunities to have them better coincide. So a number of analyses have been done by my former organization, Population Action International, working with policymakers and program managers in those countries to allow for better engagement of the gender dimension of climate change adaptation. I would also mention the World Conservation Union, IUCN, which is working with a number of countries, and most recently Bangladesh, on a number of gender and climate change adaptation strategies at the national level. And they have had a lot of traction bringing on the conservation community, but also climate change scientists and specialists. And finally, the other community that's looking at this in a much more meaningful, evidence-based, and deliberate way is the humanitarian assistance community, really looking at areas of conflict or when disaster strikes. What does it mean in particular with regard to women's vulnerability in those situations, and providing for a deliberate and purposeful relief assistance that really targets those efforts where they can have most impact. So there's quite a number of work that's going on, efforts going on in that area. So a very good question.
Can I add one?
Yes, please.
I mean, I would just add a semi-personal experience with this, and I say semi because, so when I went to Nepal, I was following a group of scientists who were working on glacier melt, and they were trekking for several weeks, and I couldn't go for the whole thing, so I was sort of meeting them on their descent, and at one point, and there was another reporter with them, Suzanne Goldenberg from The Guardian, who did tremendous reporting on this as well, and who actually just now separately has done some fantastic reporting on America's first climate refugees in Alaska. Regardless, at one point, what these scientists were doing was meeting with the local community that lived around a glacier lake called Lake Imja that is in serious. It's very vulnerable to a phenomenon known as glacier lake outburst flooding. And if there is an avalanche or an earthquake, these lakes that not so long ago were glaciers and now are lakes, could experience terrible flooding, destroying communities and livestock. The community had, I'll get to the women in a second, sorry, but the community, on the one hand, this was a very interesting meeting with community members because they had never before really been consulted by scientists about what they would like to see done with this river. Do they need to move? Is there some engineering solution that should be done? There have been hundreds of scientists that have gone up there to study this, and they had said, look, no one has ever come to us to talk about this. Where were the women? Serving tea. And so, this was a group of heavily male scientists who study glacier lake issues from around the world, meeting with a group of male community leaders, all male community leaders, about what to do. And so I think that, I don't, as a journalist, I don't know that I can offer answers of what can be done, but I think, what I see is that this sort of begins in communities where, I see a lot of work being done by the international community and the World Bank and groups that are pushing the issue of focusing on gender in climate change. I question whether that is translating on the ground in communities in parts of the world. And maybe that's where some of the beginning work or other work needs to be focused, is strengthening women's voices and roles there.
Yes, please. Question.
Thank you. Fred Tipson. I'm at the U.S. Institute of Peace. There's a dimension of this issue that I think is terribly important to consider, but it hasn't really been touched on. And that's what I would call the military intelligence response to the adaptation challenge. Probably the best resourced agencies for addressing these issues are the military and intelligence communities in the United States, at least. And it won't surprise anybody to know that they've discovered these issues as being serious national security threats. Admiral Locklear's comments about the Pacific were particularly dramatic in recent testimony, but they have their own dangers for our national security, their own backdraft dangers. And to some extent, it's being translated into the agenda of countering violent extremism. You look at the population increases in places like Nigeria and Pakistan and Egypt. Nigeria is going to add 100 million people by 2030. Pakistan, 50 million people. Egypt, 30 million people. These are, half of them at least, will be young men with nothing to do. And it's not lost on our intelligence and military analysts that that's a recipe for some serious problems in terms of extremist agendas and so forth. But needless to say, if it's the military that's delivering the solutions to these problems, we're militarizing the response in a way that's going to have serious blowback consequences. I would argue what we're doing in Pakistan is just giving Pakistanis an excuse to blame the United States for a whole series of problems that the United States has nothing to do with in the environmental realm and the resource scarcity realm. So it isn't that, I think the work that's reflected in this document is fantastic. But I think it's very important that we begin to consider, again, the most heavily resourced agencies of the U.S. government who are addressing these issues with great courage in some cases, with great political courage in defying the political criticism that climate change is, a concocted issue for political reasons. The military has been more courageous than many in addressing these issues directly and honestly. But the solutions we're coming up with have some real exposure, and I would urge us to include these in our consideration of these backdraft problems.
Thank you, Fred, and thank you for the work that you all are doing at U.S. Institute of Peace in this space as well. I think it's a critically important question. I think you're absolutely right that the military and the intelligence communities, including a number of people sitting in the room here for going on decades, have taken this issue very seriously. And I say decades in the wider environment security realm that has then become a climate and security focused one. Sitting at this table, I think it was in 1999, we had then Central Command General Zinni, 4-star Marine, and say, essentially, if these issues, seeing these issues as critically connected, particularly the natural resources, demography, and conflict ones, if they end up on his desk, it's because it's a policy failure upstream and with public and private responses that are non-military. And so it's reactive. As you say, it can often be mismatched tools, and it's trying to solve a problem that is then the product of failure to address it beforehand. And so in that sense, I think there's a recognition that it posed the potential threats. I think our backdraft argument is one that says, you think you have a lot of threats and a lot of the full picture. Here's an additional dimension as we respond to climate. Here are other considerations that you need to integrate into your not just threat analysis, but also your opportunity for engagement and facilitating cooperation in line and in collaboration with the other two Ds of the defense, diplomacy, and development. And I think that's where many of us are familiar with the important role that the Center for Naval Analysis 2007 report on climate security in the U.S. context, where they assembled 13 former flag officers, generals, and admirals who both looked at these issues and what they meant for security institutions, but I think also delivered an important message, which was we are, again, the last resort. We're reactive and our tools are not particularly well matched. So therefore, those of you in the civilian side need to get serious on addressing these problems before they come to a situation where it's increased humanitarian pace or dealing with conflict that may have some dimension that is connected to natural resource use or climate change and affected impacts. So I think there is that recognition is there. I think there is, in some ways, despite what some folks see as a eagerness to take on these issues, there's actually a great reluctance to take them on, given other things, and I think a reasonable recognition that they aren't particularly well-matched tools in some respects. And we need to hear what they're saying in terms of it being additional motivation. That said, I think we also have made mistakes in this climate security space, in the advocacy world particularly, where it is tempting to simplify and bumper sticker the climate and security links and say, well, the generals said so, so why don't all of you across the political spectrum vote for this, and not actually understand, separate or present that complexity and for what it means. So I think it's an excellent question, and one folks in this town and elsewhere, we should say, certainly the Brits have been leaders of this in particular in the UK context, but a variety of people in the room here are active participants in this discussion. We could have audience members making very good interventions on this as well.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 questions here. Start here, 1.
Jim Sang, just to follow up on the last one. Jeff talked about how we should do no harm with climate interventions, avoid creating new conflicts, and avoid exacerbating existing conflicts. I wonder if you could be a little bit more explicit. I mean, unless you freeze the world, you just have the existing conflicts. But if you make any kind of changes, you certainly create new frictions. Where do conflicts end and frictions? What are the boundaries? What's acceptable for climate policies to? What kind of changes that other people would have to react to?
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's an excellent question. I think that's in part where kind of saying it may not be fair to say do no harm. It may be unrealistic in a sense, and so that kind of minimize and maximize then is a recognition that when you make change in access to resources, there are winners and there are losers, and you are putting a value on some of these other larger goals and such. But I think it's maybe a lower threshold of understanding that if you are doing a red scheme where people who are living in those forests, and let's remember that plus in part comes because at some point the folks remembered that there are people living in the forests and that there are livelihood issues associated with it, and it's not just a ecological economic model that we need to work out. That can be done very well and is an important and powerful tool. But also we have plenty of experience, whether it's climate or just natural resource management related, that if you change access and introduce money into the system, that can be done well or poorly. So if the money is going to the national government is ranking high on some of those lack of transparency and poor governance side, the expectation that those resources as designed are going to be committed to those affected communities as the way so they see the benefit of their more limited access to those resources, then we need to understand that that's going to create problems, and we can then in that sense minimize it by how we design and how we do that. Yes, I don't want to leave an impression that we by recognizing there's conflict potential we'll be able to avoid it, and all the natural resource management is conflict management, and it's about the institutions and trying to minimize the most negative outcomes.
I've got one example of do no harm over which people in this town have complete authority, and that relates to the last question about securitizing some of this assessment. The aspects of the military intelligence and defense community have been really great and proactive on these questions. But one of the downsides of securitizing is that they classify too much of the information. So when you do an analysis about how bad the climate change news is in Pakistan and Afghanistan, big parts of Central Asia, mainland China, and then you won't release the reports and even do public summaries of them because the people at the State Department don't want to take the calls from the foreign ministry, that is doing harm, right? When you do the analysis of how this issue impacts critical areas for American security and international security, local human security and international security, and then don't want there to be a public statement about that besides mumbling 2 sentences in congressional testimony, that is not doing no harm, right? That is not fleshing out the huge critical challenge and the ways in which these issues of both the climate change, its direct impacts, and doing something about them directly impact central areas of American and international security in the decades ahead, and keeping that secret and just mumbling about it is not helping.
But ironically, it's state, not the traditional defense that wants it secret. So it's the whole community. Yeah.
Okay, you have another question?
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. My name is Janice Pratt. I'm an Atlas Court Fellow from Liberia, serving at War Watch Institute here in DC. I just wanted to perhaps comment a little bit and then ask a question, if you don't mind, especially as it relates to the conflict that he asked about. In Africa, I think one of the major reasons why we have a lot of conflict in Africa as it relates to resources is the lack of communication from the government to the people. People are very suspicious in Africa, especially as it relates to resources. Why am I saying this? Take Liberia, for example. The government instituted a policy and said that we should wear seat belts and we should only be 3 in a taxi. But they did not provide more taxis for people to ride, given the population. So that just went like 3 days, and people started protesting, and it cut down. So what am I saying is, if the government wants to institute policies on climate change, there should be alternatives. Resources, for example, what's happening in Nigeria right now. The people see the white man come in the country, process the oil, take it out. It's not really filtering down to the people. The people are not really feeling the essence of what's happening with their resources. So suspicion comes in, hate starts growing over time, and eventually the country is sitting on a time bomb. So people start looking for alternative ways to get the benefits from the resources, and it brews conflict. So if the government can start to communicate to the people, actually make them to understand the importance of the resources, how to use the resources, manage it, and probably train them in it to know that climate change is not just the white man thing, because I know a lot of organizations here do work in Africa, but trust me, not a lot of Africans, especially those in the rural areas, really know what climate change is. The people themselves are not feeling the essence of climate change, so they're not involved in the process. So in order to get us involved, the government have to really try to communicate with the people, because most governments in Africa, trust me, they have so many things on their list of priorities that climate change is like way under there. They will come to the conferences and say, oh yeah, we're gonna prioritize it, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do that. But when they go back to their respective countries, it's way down there. They're too concerned about economic development, they're too concerned about this. So the issue of probably cleaning the river in XY village, or probably trying out renewable energies, is way down there. So over time, it brews and the people are anchored underneath. So I think to really achieve climate change in Africa, we have to start restructuring our policies, perhaps go against the status quo and really get the people involved, because right now it may probably not be on Africa too much as it is in Asia and Latin America and so forth, but over time Africa is going to be having a spotlight, because there are a lot of resources there, but the people don't know how to manage it, and there's this thing between government and people in which people are suspicious. So a lot of countries, the people are basically sitting on a time bomb, getting angry. Before I close, I'll just give another example of Liberia, where I come from. There was a recent discovery of oil in the country, which sort of created mixed feelings of both suspicions that basically the government is going to eat all the money and nothing's going to come to the people. So there are already people starting to say that they're going to take the resources anyway unless we stand up and fight for our rights. So it's starting little by little, and they haven't even started processing the oil yet. So I'm just saying that in other countries that probably other resources will start developing over time, this is going to happen unless we start communicating to the people actually how to manage their resources and how to trust their governments and how the government themselves should filter back, these benefits to the people so that there can be a mutual understanding. And also, before I close, I'd just like to ask on the issue of renewable energy, how can we really introduce it to Africa, especially in the rural villages and all that? Because most people in Africa are still using generators, which create a lot of carbon monoxide and is killing people slowly. And how can these organizations who actually go in Africa to exploit the resources, how can they manage so that they can start polluting the rivers and other places in Africa?
Good. Thank you. I'd say let's take the two other questions and we ask the panel to respond to the questions together. So we have two other questions. There's one in front and one at the back.
Is this working?
Yeah, it's on.
It's on. It should be on.
It's on. Go ahead.
This is Philip Angel, former editor of the World Resources Report at WRI. Could you address the issue of that we looked at a little bit, and that had to do with the potential threat to democratic institutions that the exigencies of climate adaptation decisions can present in a lot of countries?
Thank you.
Okay. Then one final question here, and then we'll address them.
Andrew Holland with the American Security Project. So my question is kind of a devil's advocate question. I think it's a great report, and I look forward to reading it. Jeff touched a bit on the advocacy stuff, and Lisa talked about the sexy story versus the real story. And it's kind of the complexity of adaptation and mitigation. But the truth is that too often policymakers don't do complexity. They don't do, they want a straight line story. They want to hear that the generals say this, so therefore do it. Do you worry with putting out a report like this that, climate mitigation causes conflict too? Well, then we won't do it. We're not doing it enough anyway. I put a couple of things up on Twitter from what we were saying here, and I already got a couple people coming back and saying, "Why are you talking about this? Shouldn't we just get to work? Let's just get to work, and then we can deal with it later." There's an inherent tension here between kind of the academic complexity and the policymaker simplicity needed.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So we have questions around sort of communications and community involvement, renewable energy in Africa, looking at the threat to democratic institutions and sort of complexity, and let's just get to work. So Lisa, let me start with you.
I know that Jeff has a lot to say about Andrew's question in particular, and I want to touch on that, but also combine it with the question from you. Or rather the statement first. I think that while I don't know Liberia isn't a country that I've written about, fundamentally what you're talking about is institutions. And, I was recently in Pakistan on a journalism fellowship, and, what struck me were some of the same things that you're talking about. How does a country that has so many immediate challenges, providing safe drinking water, providing electricity, going to deal with these long-term challenges of climate change. It's not doing it well, and what does it need to do that when there are, like in Africa, so many things on the priority list. I think some of the best work being done, again, when you talk about the sexy story versus the complicated, maybe real story. I think some of the best work being done is in strengthening institutions when we're talking about climate adaptation. And it's a hard thing to write about because, if you tell your editor you want to write about You know, people fleeing one country to go to another, that's, you know, okay, you can wrap your mind around that. You can wrap a story around that. Strengthening governance and institutions is a much harder story to tell, but it's such a critical one, both from a journalist's standpoint and, you know, and obviously a development standpoint. I think the development world also likes, you know, not just you know, policymakers, but aid agencies like the don't do complexity either. It's not easy to put a picture of, you know, a good judicial system on a you know, on the cover of a report, and show people that you've built something or made something. And so, so to me, one of the real stories and a challenge again on how you tell that story is what's being done to build the institutions that will need to handle these issues. Briefly on renewables in Africa, I think it's a very interesting space. You know, recently I've heard the president of the World Bank speaking very encouragingly about the possibility of, you know, of electrifying Africa primarily with renewables. I think what big question in this area is how one scales up decentralized energy, and I think that's an interesting story. You know, as I travel, I've seen all these interesting projects. You know, in Haiti, they're using excess energy from a cell phone tower, from a diesel generator to create a microgrid to power a town. And in this place, they're doing this little project, and in this place, they're doing this little project. Well, how do you make these little projects? You know, how do you scale that up into something that can serve a country, much less a continent? I think that decentralized energy is going to be, you know, a big area for Africa to be, you know, to be growing in the next few years.
Thanks. Okay, quickly. On the Africa question, thanks very much for the introductions and the question. Two things. One, as you know, the problem is more complex than the governments better communicating in many parts of Africa, because in many of the resource-dependent states in Africa, citizens have very, very good reason to be suspicious of their government. And governments have very good reasons not to communicate what they're doing with resource funds, right? So, I mean, the challenge is really to improve the allocation, accountability, and such. And it's a complex set of challenges. And so I'll relate that a little bit to the renewable energy question. I think there's great stuff going on right now on communication technologies and water availability and water quality all over Africa. Some really interesting stuff. And partly that is because the costs of the technology and the usability of the technology is such that it can be deployed in really interesting ways, and that people can embrace it and make it their own. And it seems to me that we are finally approaching the area where small and medium-sized wind and solar and some biomass options we're now getting to a price point where we can conceive of that sort of African innovation with a technology that is cheap enough to begin to deploy, can really maybe take off in a better stance. So I feel like there are growing options. There are lots of pilot programs, as you say, all over the place, and we might be at the point where in cities and in rural areas, Africans are going to be able to take these technologies and these opportunities and systems and then really do something with them that that the funder and such didn't imagine, which is really the story in water now. It's really quite spectacular. And then on adaptation and democratic threats. Absolutely. And it's the same. I mean, and the thing about adaptation, I think, is that we could search and replace, and it's not being done enough. We could search and replace the word development and adaptation, and because it is the case that not nearly enough of the lessons of years of development, much of it top-down, much of it hostile to democratic participation, much of it bad for women, most of it bad for rural areas, those lessons are not being drawn enough by the adaptation discussions yet. And I'll go back to that over and over again. It's the less positive way to say that is that the adaptation crowd, in the sort of global crowd in international organizations and with lots of GIS training, they can and will make all of the same egregious mistakes of many older development projects if someone doesn't begin to stop them. That's right. So I mean that when that train leaves the station, it can go over all manner of people. And then the last on the shouldn't we get to work? Yeah, I think the related answers there. When we talk about adaptation in many of the poorest areas of the world, we have to actually talk about, in my view, development that is climate sensitive and climate concerned, right? Rather than constantly use the language of adaptation of the adaptation crowd, because what people need in their immediate lives are development opportunities, right? And so that it's a matter really of connecting the adaptation cause and the adaptation knowledge to development, and persisting in our interest in economically sustainable, socially sustainable development. And so that's how, in some respects, I would connect it. Policymakers don't like complexity, but I think that's right. But I have to say, the same is true in security writ large. You know this from what you work on, right? Is that people have to actually talk about things in complex fashion and assume that members of the United States Congress will get that completely all wrong when it appears. And I mean, this is how we go. This is how we exist in Washington, right? So there's all of this amazing expertise in the government and surrounding it, and all of this stuff. And every once in a while, it penetrates the big white building with the dome. But mostly, we have to proceed as though hoping that they simply don't get in the way.
I'll stick to just Andrew's excellent question.
None of my funding is federal, as you can see.
Andrew, thank you for the question. I think it is absolutely important that we get to work. I think the challenge is that we do it in a way that doesn't set back the ultimate goal because we didn't think through the process up front. And I'm again going to harken back to this mid-90s experience for a time where where some folks weren't as careful as they could or should have been. And the simple story actually backfired and cost us some years in taking related issues really seriously. And so many of you will remember the experience of the kind of dramatization of the academic work on environment and conflict that was done in a hugely influential Atlantic Monthly article called The Coming Anarchy by Robert Kaplan, where his kind of travel journalism reporting from Western Africa that was experiencing a horrific time in terms of governance and conflict and instability that had all sorts of connections with both renewables and non-renewables, became the framework for, in this period of trying to search for the Cold War alternative paradigm, statements such as the environment's going to be the national security issue of the 21st century, Homer Dixon's going to be more important than George Kennan in the X article, and all of you have just missed it, and this kind of apocalyptic vision is where we're all going. And that generated incredible attention, right? Sandy Berger, deputy NSC, weekend meetings, we got to figure out how we're going to respond to this, and Clinton and Gore and such. Terrific resonance around really important issues, but sold in a fashion that it could never deliver on what was promised because the whole world wasn't going to become West Africa. And so when then the cases where it was really important and complex dynamics were tried to externalize to this broader whole context of how we're going to reorient our foreign policy around it, it didn't raise to the level that was promised in this argument that got so much attention. And as a result, it became a backlash where they kind of threw out all that was important with everything else. And we spent a couple years where folks just said, oh, don't bother me with these issues. And we saw it in the ebb and flow of attention in the conversations here at the Wilson Center, because we were facilitating those conversations, and it became harder to have them. And so my fear is that it now, under the climate context, if what gets the press and what becomes the bullet point and the bumper stickers are things like 250 million environmental refugees. First of all, refugees is a formal legal term, as we all know, and it suggests crossing boundaries, and there are criteria for which environment as a push is not part of it. It's at the UN, and so anybody serious in the migration world dismisses it first. Second, as we were discussing before, migration is a complex set of pushes and pulls. And so how do we know that it is environment, let alone climate? I mean, we have attribution challenges for climate versus natural variability, right? And so it just, for those who are serious, it's a meaningless number, and it's one that just has faulty assumptions, and garners it gets you in the paper.
Sells books.
But it just doesn't then translate into, similarly, I think tremendously concerned about what these impacts will play on stability and fragility of regimes and response and maladaptation. But if we say climate wars, it's going to be a new kind, and we sell that on the Hill, and then our ask is still in 2009, do a deal at Copenhagen on cap and trade, or domestically do cap and trade, and there's no diversified ask. It's just the single ask, but somebody with a uniform is delivering it. Then, as they said, well, you're asking me for the same thing you were asking me under these other guises. Why the hell would I vote for it now if it's just, you're not asking for anything different? And I think we have really interesting and important things that are different by the differentiated view from a development, a climate, a security perspective, and how these things impact those different portfolios. So we have a lot to say. It's a hell of a lot harder to do it. And Andrew, you do it well. And I think there are many people in that space that is in analysis and advocacy that do it well. I think it's just we need to learn. We want new entrants into it, but we need to make sure as those new entrants come in, they don't make some of these mistakes of the past, and that the bumper stickers actually don't overpromise in ways that we can't deliver that ultimately set us back.
Okay, great. So thank you very much, Jeff. I think overall a great discussion that's sort of bringing together these questions around economics, governance, resource dynamics, and sort of a climate adaptation and peace building framework. I'd encourage you to have a look at our website at wilsoncenter.org and our blog at newsecuritybeat.org, and to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We have a lot more dimensions of these issues that we have explored. I especially want to thank our speakers today, Lisa Friedman from Climate Wire, Stacy Van Dever from University of New Hampshire, and Jeff DeBelco from Ohio University for, I think, what has been a really rich and enriching discussion. So thank you very much. Now, I invite you to stick around for a few minutes and chat among yourselves and with our speakers further. Thanks for coming.
I'll send you some propaganda.
Yeah.
Propaganda.
I don't have to write mine because I'm
That's
out
okay.
of
Email
cards.
me.
Okay, I will. All right.
You're listed on your university.
Yep.
Hi, how are you?
Great.
Good. Good to you.
I'm sorry, the manager for NASA Earth Science.
Hi, Stacey.